Happy Columbus Day. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Considering that we now know a lot more about Columbus than we did, let's say, when I was a kid, when they never stressed any of the bad stuff, and you know, to certainly to the native populations of the places to which Columbus arrived. Um, Columbus wasn't the arrival of Columbus wasn't a happy occasion. It wasn't something that people were glad about. He brought a different worldview. He brought uh, you know slavery in some cases, and in many instances he brought death. Actually, this kind of came up. I was watching. It was on the History Buffs YouTube channel earlier this year. A review of a movie about Columbus, where he talked about how awful essentially that Columbus was and all the bad stuff he did. And certainly he did do a lot of bad stuff. He wasn't the best guy in the world. But I think the issue on Columbus Day does become relevant. Should we still celebrate Columbus Day? And I'm trying to look at this with an open mind and see all sides of the issue. And on one hand, when you acknowledge what Columbus did in his time, he did some pretty awful, horrible stuff. If you were living here in the continental, in the Americas, in the area that was to become the Americas anyway. Um, and Columbus arrived. Um, well, let's put it this way: you wouldn't have been happy, all right, about what happened afterwards. There was, like I said, there was a lot of death. There was slavery. There was some unpleasant stuff that he brought to the native population, and essentially for them, it was the end of um, their way of life up until that point. I did want to point out, though, that their way of life up until that point wasn't entirely peaceful and, like sitting around holding hands saying "kumbaya." War among indigenous peoples was always a way of life, and it might not have been war in the way Europeans think of war in terms of a series of protracted battles with supply chains and generals. It was much more sporadic combat here and there, raids and things like that. But war certainly was a way of life among native populations, indigenous peoples, both on islands and in the continental United States. In the case of the American Indians, who you know would later, when settlers came to the mainland, basically face many of the same challenges that indigenous people faced when Columbus arrived at their places. And in that sense, yes, what Columbus did was awful, but it wasn't like everything was all roses before he arrived either. And then we have to think about everything that's happened since in the intervening many hundreds of years. If we're just looking at what Columbus did at the time, yeah, that was awful. I mean, some guy comes into your neighborhood and he starts killing people and upending your society. On the other hand, this isn't to excuse it, but historically, that's basically the history of humanity. It's only very recently that we've looked at it and said, um, wars of aggression, wars of conquest, invading and taking over other people to steal their land, their material possessions, um, take prisoners as slaves for the economy, things like that. This was a way of life for basically much of human existence. Even in so-called enlightened periods, like during antiquity, the age of Greece and Rome, this type of thing went on. It went on during the so-called Dark Ages. It went on during the Middle Ages, and it went on right up until, well, in some places in the world, it's still going on. But basically, it's a relatively new thing that we can look at this and say, well, that's wrong. They're not fighting a war of self-defense. They're fighting a war of aggression. They're invading. They're conquering. Um, there were always people, of course, who saw that perspective, but as far as that being a mainstream view, that's a relatively recent thing in history, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing that we can have that perspective now. But the reason we can have that perspective, what is that perspective born of? It's born in large part about our ideas about individual freedom, dignity, self-determination, the relationship of the citizen to the state, to the government. Does the individual exist as an end in himself to live his free life, or is he, you know, a beast of burden for the apparatus of the state or the collective or the tribe, etc. And interestingly enough, the arrival of Columbus, a person who did an awful lot of bad stuff that we now look at from these perspectives as bad. Um, his arrival laid the groundwork for those ideas following him, taking hold, and in what was to become the 13 colonies and then later the United States, giving birth to a nation where this would essentially be the guiding political philosophy. That freedom and individual self-determination is prominent, and so on and so forth. And so essentially, it's due to everything that happened after the arrival of Columbus that we're even able to look back at what he did at the time with a view of moral clarity that allows us to condemn the things he did that were bad. The only reason we have that perspective is because of the legacy that followed after him, which was, everything coming from the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, and the the birth essentially of the idea of individual self-determination and self-government, which of course came to fruition in the United States in the 18th century. You know, many hundreds of years after Columbus, but you could argue that that's what set everything in motion. Now, one could also argue that if it wasn't Columbus, maybe somebody else would have come along, and maybe a kinder, gentler, nicer person would have been the person to make that initial contact between Europe and the indigenous peoples here and the lands here, and that first step in allowing those Enlightenment ideas to come over here and find a place where they could grow and mature and lead to not only this country but that worldview, that might have skipped all the unpleasantness of the killing and the enslaving and all of that stuff that happened during Columbus. Maybe. The point is we'll never know because that didn't happen. Columbus got here first. Maybe a kinder, gentler person would have come along. Maybe not. But history isn't a question of what ifs and maybes. History is a question of what actually happened. And I guess the question is, if you're looking at what happened as a result of Columbus arriving in the United States, from well, he didn't arrive in the United States at all, actually, but of Columbus arriving in the West. If you're looking at in its totality, the sum total of everything from then up until now, it's an interesting thing because a lot of the stuff, most of the stuff actually that Columbus did was awful, but as a result of him simply making that contact, it allowed things to happen after him that had a net gain, not only for what was to become America, but for, I would argue, the world, right? Where would we be without the ideas of individual self-determination and self-government and individual freedom and dignity? Ideas that admittedly would have been as alien to Columbus as they would to Pol Pot, but nevertheless, we have to look at everything that's happened as a result of it, not just what he did at the time. And I would argue that everything that's happened as a result of it is in fact a reason to still celebrate Columbus Day. Not because of Columbus, but because of everything that happened after Columbus. And maybe we should, in that case, change the name. I don't know. But I think because of the history, and it's admittedly a romanticized and heavily edited history that people have had of Columbus up until recently, essentially glorifying the man. That it's just it's too convenient a name that if we change the name to something else, that people wouldn't get the significance. You know, we could say, you know, contact between Europe and the Americas Day or something, or you know, the birth of the Enlightenment in the Americas Day, and nobody would know what the hell we were talking about. Um, it might be more accurate because again, the things there are to celebrate about Columbus really have nothing to do with Columbus. It's about everything that happened afterwards that led to positive um, things. Whereas what Columbus was doing at the time was just pretty much god awful. But here's the thing. Uh, I don't think changing the name would accomplish anything. I think, in a way, you could make an argument for it, but it's like, you know, it's just going to make it harder to to get what you're talking about. It's kind of like in the bike world. It's kind of like the concept of the English racer. Um, Anybody who knows about bicycles, when they hear English racer, they think an actual racing bike that just happens to be of English manufacture. Um, but to the general non-cycling public, or to the layman who doesn't know hardly anything about vintage bicycles, he hears English racer. He knows exactly what it means. It's one of those old three speeds with upright roadster bars. Now the name is completely ignorant. The bikes had nothing to do with racing. You know, bicycle racing is a sport. They were never used in races. They were never used by racers. They get nothing to do with racing. Why do they call them English racers? It's lost in the mist of time. But the point is that to the knowledgeable cyclist, the name is a misnomer, and I've argued for years that we should stop calling them English racers. However, I've also acknowledged that if we called them something else, yes, it would make more sense to the minority of people who actually know the difference, i.e., the expert cyclists or the knowledgeable cyclists, but to the vast majority of people using the term, it makes sense and they know what it means, even though it's incorrect. So we would be getting a more accurate term, but at the expense of basically having to re-educate the entire public. And is it worth it when the content is the same? It's just the name that's misleading or historically inappropriate. So it's kind of the same thing. We could call Columbus Day something else and still celebrate all the things we do now, which is basically nothing to do with Columbus and simply everything that was a result of things that happened after him. But what would it accomplish? You could say, well, it wouldn't be honoring somebody who enslaved and killed lots of people, which would be a good change. But on the other hand, as heinous as some of his actions were, he did lead the way for all the good stuff that happened afterwards. So, you know, I don't think we should try and, one, I don't think we should try and whitewash history, but two, I don't think we should try and um, tinker with the definitions and the words we use too much. Accuracy is important, but there's accuracy in nomenclature, and then there's accuracy in understanding. And if we change the name to be more accurate, we may actually obscure the understanding, because again, the whole point is that this started with Columbus. We might not necessarily be honoring Columbus, the guy that enslaved and killed a bunch of people, but we are honoring all the positive things that happened from the advent of Western civilization, developing and maturing, and eventually giving rise to the ethos of what became the U.S. So, you know, should we celebrate Columbus Day? I would argue yes, but not because of Columbus. Lone Rider out.